All right, everybody knows what large language models are in this room, I assume. And I'm a cognitive scientist, so my primary job is to try to understand thought in natural systems like humans and other animals. But a lot of the way that we explore that is through computer modeling. So this new wave of deep learning, and particularly large language models, is really, it's been an interesting innovation, and it's forced us to rethink a lot of what we mean by thinking. This talk is modified from its original version. The original version is about the crisis of large language models affecting education and formal education. And how are we supposed to train people how to think if they have access to really good large language models whenever they need them? Because the large language models are so good that they can basically replace the thinking that we normally had humans to do. Now, this talk is modified so that it's more for a business crowd, where it's maybe not important whether the person actually did the thinking or whether the machine did the thinking, as long as you get the results that you want. If you can get a machine to do it cheaper, then that's great, and I completely understand that. But I did want to talk about, from what I perceive to be why critical thinking and other skills in a human being is still important, even though we have large language models that can do a lot of sort of, you might want to say, the intellectual grunt work. So you all know that large language models are really good, but I'm just going to throw a couple of statistics up here to show how good they are. GPT-4 scored within the top 1% of humans on a creativity test. Okay, so I started my training in artificial intelligence at a time when people would blithely say that computers aren't creative, and now they're more creative than 99% of the people out there. They trained GPT on course material, and it scored higher than students in one study. Okay, and people are using these large language models like crazy. Okay. And it has the fastest adoption rate. ChatGPT is the fastest adoption rate of any technology in history, from what I can tell, including the wheel and Fire. We're talking everything. The iPhone. ChatGPT just really took off. It being a digital product helped, right? But it is just free to use, and everyone is really using it. This is probably a little bit dated. But at the time of several months ago, 89% of students admitted to using ChatGPT to help with a homework assignment. And I just need to go to a coffee shop to see this happening. They've got, ChatGPT window is always open, helping them do whatever. And 92% of programmers are using AIs of various kinds to help them do their programming. And I, as probably many of you have witnessed, it really is an amazing productivity booster. So the large language models are very good, and they can do a lot of the things that traditionally required thinking on the part of humans to do. So, maybe if you've got a business or you're hiring somebody, maybe you want people to use large language models. I recently read about a video game company that made a card battle game, like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering or something, and they hired one artist to use AI to create all the art assets for the entire game. That's a huge savings. The artists weren't pleased. Like the artists of the world weren't pleased with this, but this is the way it's going. You can get a lot done cheap. So if you want, if you want them to use large language models, there are, I think, a couple of considerations here. One is that you would want to test their ability to use the generative AIs, okay? A lot of hiring nowadays involves tests of various kinds or different kinds of evaluations. And if you want to see how well they use the large language models, you give them an opportunity to use large language models or whatever to try to do something for the job. However, if you are still interested in them being personally competent, intellectually, critical thinking, knowledgeable, any of these kinds of things, then when you're hiring, you need to ensure that during the hiring process, the tests that you're giving them they either are not allowed to use generative AI, like forbidden, I don't mean not allowed. You have to make sure that they don't. This is the problem that we encounter in formal education where people are competing for grades. You know, if you put them down with pencil and paper and you make them have all their phones away and they're proctored, then right now, until they're like embedded in their glasses or whatever, they're not going to use large language models. That's the way to ensure it, right? But if you want to evaluate them without generative AI, then you need to be creative about coming up with a way to make the evaluation happen without their being able to use it. Because if you don't disallow it in any very serious way, I think most of them are going to use it. And then you just might not be getting accurate data about the competence of the human being. Just because I'm a scientist, this is a little chart about large language model related keywords. You might have heard of this, but like ChatGPT likes certain words: commendable, intricate, and delve. Nell, to use delve in my intro, I was wondering if you used ChatGPT to come up with it. But like delve shows up all the time. There's just certain words that they like. And so what they've done is they've tracked the use of these words in scientific publications. And look, it just sort of shoots up as soon as ChatGPT was invented. So scientists are using it to even write their papers. And, you know, you might think that you can detect AI-generated words. I just sort of poked fun at Nelda's intro because he used the word delve. But I don't know. I don't know if ChatGPT was used, and you can't know. So the AIs that they have to try to detect ChatGPT only are 74% accurate. And if it's altered slightly by a human being, it drops to 42%. And even linguists detected AI-generated text only less than 40% of the time. And if linguists can't do it, what hope do us mortals have? So if you're confident that when you're reading something, you can tell whether it was AI generated or not, I suspect that you are probably very overconfident. Okay, so is critical thinking still important? This is a question that keeps coming up in my world. It comes up in education. It's like, well, I mean, they're going to have generative AI when they get out in the workplace. So what do we actually need to teach them anymore? Is the traditional stuff that we've been teaching them to do an outdated, irrelevant skill set? Should we be focusing on other things? And what should those things be? This is something that we're still figuring out. But here's some thoughts I have about why you want a really smart, competent, hardworking person, even when they can use large language models all the time. And one way to put it is that your workplace is probably more complex than a large language model context window. Okay, there's more going on, right? Somebody who has been in an organization for a long time has an enormous amount of knowledge about how things work, common sense about things that aren't written down even, right? And when you are trying to get generative artificial intelligence to do reasoning and to come up with ideas and solutions that are specific to the problems that you're dealing with, right now anyway, there's a fundamental bottleneck in the context window that is probably too small for many of the decisions that need to be made. Now, you can often detect that the solution that the AI came up with is insufficient, but that requires the exact kind of critical thinking that I'm saying is important, okay? To be able to look at what it generated and evaluate it, to know what it missed, is something that the AI is not going to be able to do for you. And large language models are not conducive for use in conversation. When you're literally talking to someone, you're in a meeting and there's rapid back and forth. This is also an argument for the education with knowledge and memorization, which gets a bad rap in education nowadays. But if, you can just look it up. But you need a certain base of knowledge to know what to look up, to know that there is something to look up. Anyway, so when it comes to thinking and evaluating ideas rapidly in a conversational context, there simply isn't time to go through the prompting process of using large language models. Now, I'm going to say creativity, but I'm not one of these people who says that AI can't be creative. I'm talking about creativity with a big capital C here. I think that there very well might be breakthroughs in in science or design or engineering or something that uses generative AI that is sort of putting together patterns of things that have happened in the past in new and interesting ways. But for the most part, these, the large language models anyway, they're reconstructing text from the world of text that it's been trained on, and it is doing, I would say, a kind of analogical reasoning with what it's read before. So truly like groundbreaking, revolutionary, paradigm-shifting ideas, I think, are unlikely to come out of large language models. That said, they're also very unlikely to come out of humans. God knows I've been trying to come up with a revolutionary scientific idea for 30 years and I haven't done it. So, but right now, humans seem to be the best bet for it. So I've used these large language models. They can be very creative, like on a small scale, using this kind of thing. But I still think there's room for human creativity that you could potentially be looking for during hiring and maybe trying to test for in an environment without large language models. Also keep in mind that most of these language models are pre-trained. That's the P in GPT, pre-trained, which means you train the entire model at once. You train it on all the data at once, and if you try to train it on more data afterward, you can get catastrophic interference, and it can sort of wreck it. And what this means is that unless you've got something else on top of the large language model that is keeping it up to date, it will not have very up-to-date knowledge. Okay? Things that happened today, things that happened a week ago, unless the model was trained since then, it's not going to know about it. And I use know in scare quotes because it's arguable whether large language models know anything at all or believe anything at all, but it can't use that information. So to the extent that a business is at a very cutting edge where it's rapidly dealing with very, very recent information that's relevant, makes the large language models less useful because they need to be pre-trained, which is very expensive. And your workers should understand a domain well enough to know whether what the generative AI gives you makes any sense. This is something I mentioned a little bit earlier. But, as good as the stuff that comes out of the large language models are, often you need to do multiple prompting. You need to do lots of iteration with that to get the right thing, to get it the best it can be. But evaluating whether or not it's the best it can be is something that somebody with expertise has to be able to do. Okay? So I'm not a materials scientist. Okay? I don't know anything about materials science. And I can go up to ChatGPT and ask it a materials science question, like what would be a good material that is, to hold water but is heat resistant or something like that, and it'll come up with some complex thing. I can ask it for maybe the chemical structure even, it can try. But I would have no idea if what it said made any sense at all, okay? So when you're, if you were in a hiring situation and you wanted to get somebody who could use effectively large language models, I think it would be important to be able to identify whether the person can have a good bullshit detector for what the AI can generate. There was a famous case you might have heard of where a lawyer used ChatGPT to make a case, and the judge caught this lawyer because the cases were fabricated. They were hallucinated cases. They weren't even real cases. It wasn't even like they were misinterpreting what would happen in the case. It was just a case that was never made. And the lawyer said that he didn't know that ChatGPT could do that. But the lawyer trusted the output. This is a lawyer, right? This is really bad. Trusted the output of the large language model, right? Maybe the lawyer did have the expertise, but didn't bother to use it, right? But this is, you all know about hallucination, so you need that kind of skill. So I'm going to move on a little bit and just talk about, are large language models really thinking? This is something that comes up a lot. And I thought you might appreciate kind of a cognitive scientist's perspective on this. But I'll say at first that for the most part, it doesn't much matter whether it's actually thinking or not, if what you're trying to get is good performance and good results. But I will say that thinking is not a very well-defined term in science. Even in cognitive science, which is presumably all about thinking, where the boundaries of where thinking begins and ends is not really clear, okay? So if I ask you what 2 plus 2 is, you don't have to do math to give me the answer. You simply retrieve that the answer is 4, okay? So, did you think to do that? Well, is a simple memory retrieval in response to a routine question that you get all the time thinking? That's not something that we have an answer to, simply because thinking isn't very well defined. However, if you consider thinking to be a stepwise process whereby you manipulate symbols according to logic and probability and other kinds of things, then it's very probable that large language models are not thinking. As I said, they're probably doing some sort of analogy where it has been trained on an enormous amount of text, and then it is able to create new text that makes sense given what it has read before in an analogical kind of way. What shocked cognitive scientists and just about everybody else in the world is how much it could do with only that. Okay? A lot of cognitive scientists were absolutely blown away by ChatGPT's performance. We didn't think that it could go that far, just like using what you've heard before. But, you know, we also hadn't ever seen anything like it. Large language models, some numbers I read, trained on 133 million pages of text. It would take a human 2,200 years just to read it once. So, yeah, it can do amazing things that might make you think that it's planning, make you think that it's doing some kind of a cognitive process that you might recognize, okay? But if you've got a field of expertise that you know really well, sometimes somebody might come up to you and ask a question that you've heard a million times. They think it's a really deep question, and you answer it right off the bat. You rattle it off. You've answered it many times before. You're not doing a lot of thinking to do that. They might think you've done a lot of thinking. They might even think, holy moly, they thought so fast. They're so brilliant. I'm not trying to take anything away from your intelligence, but it doesn't take brilliance to repeat an answer that you've given many, many times, okay? And so, because no humans can behave like ChatGPT can, haven't read so much, that you can think of it a little bit like somebody who has answered every question in the world so many times that they can just give these rote answers to it. There's some evidence out there that large language models have something called linguistic competence, but not formal language. I'm sorry. They don't have linguistic competence, but they do have formal language abilities. It's a very interesting paper that talked about how even in human beings, there are parts of the brain that sort of just generate language and parts that do thinking. And you can have one destroyed and not the other. So there are people out there who are kind of acting like ChatGPT, who can talk, but over time it makes no sense because there's not a real reasoning process behind it, right? But those people aren't very good at doing stuff because they haven't read everything that's ever been written, right? So ChatGPT gets away with it, and large language, I'm saying ChatGPT, but I mean large language models in general. They can get away with it because they've read so much. But essentially, according to this idea, it's not thinking in a way that makes sense with how a human might do it. Now, all that said, ChatGPT, I think, has around 200 neural network layers. That is a lot of layers. That's way more than probably humans need to do most things. And even though large language models are trained to only predict the next word, that's all it was trained to do, is what I hear sometimes. It was only trained to predict the next word. We really don't know what it figured out how to do to be so good at predicting the next word. And it had 200 layers to mess with and monkey with. So maybe it is planning. Maybe it is doing all these kind of there's enough steps. If you've got 200 layers, you've got enough steps to do stepwise thinking. Is it actually doing it? We don't know. We don't really know how these large language models do what they do. What I mean by that is if you ask it to, like I recently got back from a trip, and I used a large language model to help plan the trip. I said, hey, we're going to these countries on these days. Where should I go? And we kind of did what it said, right? But you can go to somebody at OpenAI and say, how did ChatGPT come up with this itinerary? And they're really not going to have an answer for you. It's going to be vague, activation talk, right? So I think that we're going to gradually try to figure out how it's thinking, and if we can understand it, that'll be great. We might not be able to. But this makes me really humble, That's a big number. That's a big number. Okay, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to take some questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Jim?
Thank you. So you were saying that you're still figuring out what kind of things you have to teach people in the new era of LLMs. What are those things, and do you have ideas already? Like what new cognitive skills will be very in demand?
I don't think a lot of new cognitive skills are in demand. I'm still trying to fight for the old cognitive skills. So the kind of things that I said, that workforces still need, to me says that we have a responsibility to try to force students to think without the help of large language models in university. I am working with a student right now on writing a paper that I at first fundamentally disagreed with, but she persuaded me on what new skills should we be teaching students, given that they will be using large language models and generative AI in the workforce. And I did read I think yesterday that some companies were complaining that students don't know how to use them correctly. So it's tricky because the field is changing really fast, and you don't want to give them information that's going to be outdated in a year, or you don't want to give them skills that will be outdated in a year. I think that people were starting to get jobs, prompt engineering for Midjourney, but now those jobs are gone because Midjourney got better, and you don't need a really good prompt engineer to get good images. So we want to give them skills that are transferable and we're going to last a long time, and we're still trying to figure out what those are. The problem is that not every course is going to allow people to use large language models, and if you're training people in one course to use AI better, it helps them cheat in the other courses. So we're still trying to figure it out. Can you say that again?
So I said, you mentioned ChatGPT had 200 neural layers.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I said, do you have like a frame of reference to make me understand how much that is?
How much 200 layers is? What that means?
Yes.
So when a neuron in a human brain, a neuron will fire and it sends an electrochemical signal that's pretty slow. It's about the speed of a donkey cart. And then it hits a neurotransmitter, or it hits a synapse, and it has to communicate with chemicals. And it happens pretty fast by human standards, but it's not super fast in the real world. So a dinosaur, like a brontosaurus that got hit on the tail, the brain wouldn't really know about it for like a second or two. And so these synapses can slow it down, right? So every time you go through another layer, there's a bit of a speed bump. So the brain probably evolved to have optimized minimizing the number of layers that a thinking process has to go through to respond in time to certain things in the world. Some things don't require that level of speed, but certainly, getting out of the way of looming objects and whatever it does. I don't know a whole lot about how many layers are used for any tasks. Do you have anything on the top of your head, Jen? Like a human being, like how many neural network layers they would use for any task? Do you have any ballpark ideas? Right, right. Yeah. So just given so you can like think about how many layers it could possibly go through by looking at the response time of human beings. So that's why I think the 200 layers in an artificial neural network is quite a lot.
Because you're a computer scientist, so we have ideas and then we have the language in which we put it in, and currently everything, because the most amount of data we have is in English, so most of the models are trained on it. Do you think the performance of such networks will depend on like a language? I was just curious because I have heard it say that a lot of people who speak different languages, like different people from different parts of the world, have different way of thinking, and it is primarily derived through language. Do you think there is something there?
All right, good question. So how much is this an English thing and how much is it not? So although large language models take in prompts in a particular language and output stuff in a particular language, my understanding, though, is that the internals, it's not actually words. It's these sort of abstract things that are created from words. And so in a sense, it's using a language-free ontology of concepts. However, you're going to get a slightly different bunch of concepts with different languages. I'm not speaking because I've read anything about this, but I do know that just about any concept can be described in almost any language. And all languages in the world are sort of equally powerful, give or take. And so I don't know if it would be a big deal difference. So there are certain things where languages have a lot of differences, like prepositions are all over the place. Like we would say that this, I don't even know what you'd call this, but this panel here is on the wall. We also would say that your chair is on the floor. Well, those are very different spatial relationships, but we have one word for it. In other languages, that's not the case. In Korean, there's a word for something fitting snugly in something else. There's like a preposition for that. And so that facilitates certain kinds of thoughts and disfacilitates others. But I think it would be an empirical question. Did you have a follow-up to that?
I can confirm ChatGPT is bad in Russian. Well, not as good as in English.
Okay, so it's bad in Russian, right? Probably because it hasn't been, trained a lot in Russian. I think the question is, if you've got, let's just say that you had some hypothetical large language model that was trained on as much Russian as another large language model that was trained on English, would they think fundamentally different ways? I think that's kind of an unknown question. Do we have time for more, or do you want to wrap up?
Maybe one last question.
I have more of a political question, actually. So it looks like ChatGPT and language learning models, they're automating different types of thinking. So that's going to send a signal to a lot of people saying that in order to do certain projects at university and do other kinds of academic work, I don't have to do certain types of thinking anymore because I can use the language models in order to do that. And then they stop that kind of thinking. And by stopping that thinking, they are more susceptible because they don't have these critical thinking skills that people learn normally by doing academic work to be able to detect what misinformation is, or they are more likely to fall into the rabbit hole of like social media.
Yeah.
And then they could fall either like they could be Trump supporters or they could support the left-wing equivalent. And then you have political polarization and instability. And is there a danger that we could be going down that path because of these language models?
Okay, so there were some ancient Greeks who were really opposed to writing because it would hinder people's memory. And although we sort of chuckle at that, I don't think there's any doubt that our memories are worse than they used to be. I mean, how many phone numbers do you have memorized? How many ways to get around the city? people who are old enough can remember needing to remember. And certainly a lot of memory skills that were more common in the past are no longer needed now. So in a way, the Greeks were right. Our memories did decline. Our abilities to remember and memorize things did decline because of the ability to write them down and just be able to retrieve it from the writing. However, none of us would trade it because the writing that we have is accessible and it's basically worth it. And I think that it could be something similar with respect to politics here because, yeah, okay, even if the students are worse at critical thinking because they're using AIs, they're also going to have AI filters to help them catch stuff anyway. We are in a world where people are kind of easily getting into bespoke zeitgeists where they just hear stuff that they already believe with, and I think that the next step is that people are going to have artificial intelligences that are helping sort through and find errors with whatever it is. So just because the person is getting less good at critical thinking doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be more susceptible to bad ideas, because it might be that the AIs help them where they're not using it themselves. Wrap it up? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jim. All right.